Okay, thank you for joining me. My name is Jeff Goulart, and this is a short webinar on what we consider to be the three essential leadership skills in the responsive leadership model. And we'll talk more about what the responsive leadership model is at future dates. We've actually got a little series planned starting in May that will introduce you to responsive leadership and how it might be different from some of the other models that are out there and how you can apply it to from everything from parenting to leadership, education, helping, and everything in between. Basically, where two people collide and one of them has responsibility over the other person, responsive leadership ideas and strategies and principles apply. And so this is just a quick introduction to, like I said, the three essential leadership skills. And why did we land on three? Well, really because there's so many. 1,000 might be a bit of a stretch, but it's so hard to remember. And there's lots of different lists out there of the dozen different strategies that you have to be a leader, the 101 strategies to be successful in leadership. And a lot of them I think are used in different scenarios in different places at different points in time, from strategic planning to decision making to motivating employees. But there's a foundation. There's three that belong to kind of a core group of skills that if you have them, I think they account for 80 or 90% of our impact. That's been my experience with leaders when I've noticed that these skills are lacking. We have a really hard time in getting things done. And so let's get going. What are these three? And so the first one is self-awareness, and particularly self-awareness about a couple of key things. We say self-awareness as if you just need to be totally aware of everything, and no one really defines it for us. So I'll define it for you, what I think self-awareness is. We'll talk about self-care, which is actually probably one of the hardest ones for us to wrap our heads around, because we've always considered it, or at least I have, to be this optional thing that I did on Friday nights or Saturdays, or when I took a holiday and we went somewhere warm and sunny in the winter, that was self-care, right? Or a yoga class or a glass of red wine or a bubble bath or whatever. We have a tough time sometimes really conceptualizing what self-care is. So we'll talk about that a little bit today as well, reconceptualizing it. And then feedback. And I did a full webinar, short, fast, hard-hitting, a dozen strategies to improve feedback, but we'll talk a bit more about feedback and what some of the initial barriers might be and how you can address those in your practice. So let's get going. Let's talk about self-awareness, and particularly self-awareness around these three domains. The domain of motivation, awareness about what motivates you. Why are you showing up to work? What do you want out of your practice? What do you want for your people? What do you want for your company or your organization or the world around you, your community? What's actually driving you? Right? I did a workshop recently, and one of the leaders in the room basically said, my staff are only there for the paycheck, or I've got a couple of people and that's all they can see. The benefit is they're motivated by the paycheck, and it's really frustrating for me. And I kind of paused and I said, how's that frustrating? Like, that's the easiest place to motivate someone from. If that's true, if they're really actually only there for the paycheck, if that's their motivation to show up to work, then all you have to do is really clearly lay out the expectations and the behaviors that you want to see in order for them to get their paycheck. And they're either going to be the easiest person in the world to motivate in that way, or that's not actually the case. And that's usually not the case. And we'll talk a bit about motivation. Self-awareness also around power. Power is what explains our ability to have an impact in the world and to affect change. And so there's a couple of different types of power, and power shows up in lots of different ways in our practice. And so we'll talk about that. And finally, emotional intelligence, or this EQ, this ability to see your impact on other people, to notice what's going on emotionally for yourself, and be able to respond accordingly. Respond to the world, be responsive to the world instead of being reactive to the world. So motivation, we're actually going to do a full webinar on this as part of the suite of responsive ideas. But really, motivation, why we do the things that we do, falls into these three main categories. We all have needs, usually unconscious, kind of basic needs, everything from eating, sleeping, getting, affection and love, to growth and autonomy and competence and a sense of contributing to the world. And at any different given time, our needs are more aware. We're more aware of our needs, or they're more at the forefront than at other times. But you can think around this, when you're thirsty, and you know that you're thirsty and you need to go get a drink of water. So needs really will supersede these other things, our values, goals, and strengths. But values are really the operating system. Values are the things that you care about, the things that drive your practice. And so you might be, one of your values might be collaboration. And so it really bothers you when people go off on their own and don't collaborate or consult or don't embrace teamwork in the same way that you do. So values give us an indication of what we care about, and they motivate us to do the things that we do. everyone should be familiar with goals. They're kind of the least motivating, right? Especially when when they're not embedded in our values or we don't acknowledge our needs. And sometimes motivation, we find ourselves in this place as leaders of the only tool we have to motivate people is goals. And that would be the case with that person in the paycheck. The goal is to get the paycheck, right? That can be a hollow goal unless someone really, really cares about that. And lots of times we get these external goals, somebody imposing goals on us, and they're not that motivating, but that's really where the rubber hits the road. Goals give timelines, they give tasks, they give activities and outcomes. The final domain of motivation is around strengths. And I think universally, we're kind of bad at this. We tend to gravitate towards the squeaky wheels and they tend to get the grease. And we find ourselves kind of drifting towards a deficit focus or a weakness focus, trying to improve people's weaknesses, get them up to baseline. But really, when I think about strengths, and we'll talk again more about this later, about how to find them and how to leverage them and how to build them. But strengths are really, what are you good at? Are you good at something? And in which case we gravitate usually towards doing that. And so I tried to pick up the guitar about a year ago. My wife bought me some lessons and I picked it up and I tried for about a month or two and I was just strumming along and I wasn't getting better. I wasn't very good. And the guitar has sat in the corner for the last year or so. Just not very good at it, but there's other things that I'm good at. And so I prefer to do those because it's more motivating because I have a sense of accomplishment. So those four, known as the core four motivators, and we'll talk much more about that. We'll actually bring a guest on, my colleague Stephen DeGroot, and he'll do a full webinar on how to really leverage these into motivation. The next thing that we need to be aware of, so this is still in the self-awareness category, is power. What do we know about power and what is power? And so lots of us have a different experience with power. We all have a unique power history around how we've experienced people in authority and how we've experienced our own authority and our own power. So that's a question to ask yourself, like, what do you know about your power? What do you know about your influence, your ability to impact change in the world? Are you really conscious of that? Or is it kind of this unconscious thing where you go around like a bull in the china shop, having an impact and maybe not being as aware as you could be? There's three different types of power, and we'll do a full webinar on power coming up. This is really just an overview. There's three different types of power. There's personal power. There's the ability to affect change in your own life, to get things done. And we might think of that as charisma and creativity and communication and discipline and willpower and those kinds of things. The ability to get up in the morning, take charge of your day, get things done, or to pursue an education or a job or anything like that. There's another type of power called role power. And role power is really power that's been given to you, the power to affect change for somebody else. And usually we're rewarded for that in some way. So that's I'm hired to do a job. I have a salary and job expectations, and there's somebody else in a down power position from me. So when we get into role power, we can start to see an up and down power. And again, that's not good or bad. That's just kind of what's so. Is I have the power to affect change in your life. And so what do we know about that in our practice? How do we know how that shows up and some of the consequences of that type of power? We talked a little bit about feedback, about vulnerability, and people who have someone above them with power to affect change are more vulnerable and often will not give feedback in meaningful ways. And so role power comes with it a set of opportunities and a set of challenges. And being aware of what those are is really important. Final piece of power is status power or privilege. And that's power that has been granted to us because of membership in a different group in society. And so it might be that we speak a dominant language or we belong to a certain religion or ethnicity. And with that comes just the ability to affect change, not because it's part of your role or because it's part of who you are, but it's again that membership in groups. So are you aware of that? All right, so all three of those, we tend to experience these three types of power just as life and interactions with people. And we benefit when we're able to tease them out a little bit and say, okay, what do I know about my own power? My own discipline, willpower, charisma? What do I know about what's been granted to me because of the roles that I have in life? And what do I just carry with me as part of my status? Awareness of that will help us see our impacts in a different way. And one way to conceptualize power or to think about it is that we all have these tendencies and these preferences around how we show up in leadership positions. And so some of us are really relationship focused. Some of us are really task focused. And when we break it down into a spectrum, you can see that, I tend to be a bit of a task-focused person, but my ability to migrate into a place where it's more about the relationship than it is about checking things off my to-do list, the more able I am to move freely back and forth between those two tendencies, the more effective I am as a leader. Same thing goes with boundaries, and there's probably a dozen other spectrums that we'll talk about when we do power specifically. But do you have really firm boundaries? Kind of unbending, or are you kind of flexible with that? Will you have conversations and go different places with people that you might not be firmly in your role? And there's challenges and opportunities wherever you land on any of these spectrums. It's not to say that one's better than the other, but that awareness around how you typically show up might help explain how other people are responding or reacting to you. So self-awareness around our motivation, power, and the last one is emotional intelligence. And here's the definition that I found that I think is useful, and it's the capacity to be aware of, control, and express your emotions, and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. And that empathetically piece is really important piece of leadership, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's move on to self-care, the next set of skills. So self-awareness in those three domains is the first essential leadership skill. Self-care is actually the second. And I think that a reframe from, like I said before, I've tended to view it as optional. And for me, when I started to see it as part of my ethical practice, it suddenly took on a new weight, a new importance. Because one of the things about power in particular is that when we're not well, when we're not our best selves, when we're stressed out or burnt out or preoccupied with unmet needs of our own, we're not effective. And I've experienced that myself when I've been burnt out. I got diabetes at one point, and I had some anxiety at another point in my leadership journey. And I was not very effective for the people that I served because I wasn't well. And so that's probably the biggest take home around self-care, is that it's ethical. Right? As a leader, it's not selfish to look after yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes. And there's 4 different domains of self-care. And so that's where I think that one of the things that happens is we conceptualize it as this thing that I can do after work, and I'll go to my yoga class and that'll be fine. But there's 4 domains of self-care that you should consider. And the first is balance and boundaries. And I actually think that the number one most important act of self-care is the ability to say no. Especially if you're a helper, a leader, you're in that mode of helping other people get their needs met. It's really easy in that context to say yes to everything and start to say no to your own needs, and you find yourself out of balance. And so we could talk a lot about balance and work-life balance and workaholism and engagement and all of that. There's some interesting podcasts maybe I'll send out via email to everybody to listen around that. But boundaries, really, really critical to self-care. Rest is the other domain. And so usually, it's not actually just the trip to Mexico for 2 weeks, and you can white knuckle it through the year and, wait till vacation, and then I'll rest up and I'll recharge, and then I'll hit the ground running and I'll be fried in a couple of months. And so how can you embed rest into your practice, into your daily practice? And so maybe that's looking at your schedule. Maybe that's taking a walk at lunchtime instead of, working through. Maybe sometimes it's actually just 3 deep breaths before you go into a meeting or a challenging conversation, right? Listen to a song, put some music on, go just shut the lights off in your office, put your head on your desk for 10 minutes and just power nap or something. But rest as pretty critical, because our brains can only function at a certain capacity for so long before they need a break in our bodies. The third domain is satisfaction. And those can be flowers or those can be fireworks. I don't know. I'm not the best artist, but finding satisfaction in our work, being able to actually hit the pause button in a busy day and say, wow, that went really, really well. And I'm going to enjoy this moment of satisfaction around the conversation I just had with an employee, or the outcome that we just had, or that great meeting that met one of my needs. And so noticing when needs are being met or values are being lived, or somebody sees something somebody's really great at, and taking that time to be satisfied with that. That's self-care, right? That's a reminder that what you're doing matters and it's important. And the final domain is support. And support looks like, supervision, being able to go to your leader, the person that supports you, and get feedback, get guidance. And so a couple of different types of support networks that you might want to think about in your life. One of them is kind of an administrative support. Do I have somebody to just support me with the logistics and the administration and the overwhelming nature of that, and the logistical support? There's leadership support. Do I have somebody who I can go to when I have a leadership challenge, somebody who will coach me, challenge me, give me tough feedback? Right? And who can I just lean on when I'm having a shitty day and go for beers with and just talk about how crappy it was, but they don't need to fix it for me. So a couple of different kinds of support networks make self-care a lot easier, or contribute to our wellness. So a couple of tips to operationalize self-care, because when you shift from it being optional to it being ethical, it suddenly becomes part of your job as a leader to ensure that the people below you are also well and also looking after themselves. And that was a shift for me in my leadership practice, to take it away from the individual. We still have responsibility for that, but to support people as part of my job is your wellness. And so one thing we did is we incorporated it into supervisions. We would talk about it freely, just like we would talk about job performance. We'd start talking about wellness. And one of the things about self-care and our wellness is that it changes over time. And so it can't be a yearly conversation. It has to be an ongoing thing. And so whether you embed it in your staff meetings or your one-on-ones, and you find a way to measure it, and even if it's just simple sliding scales, and I'll send everybody a simple handout that measures, it's got 20 different self-care ideas inside of these 4 different domains. You can just track them over time and see if things change. And if things change, then you can develop strategies and tools and resources to address it. And finally, the third essential skill, aside from self-awareness and self-care, is feedback. And I talked a lot about feedback at the last webinar, and you've got the link to that if you're on the mailing list. You can go back and watch and see these kind of 12 practical strategies. But feedback is absolutely essential for leadership because it's how we find out if our impacts line up with our intentions. I've never met a leader who said, you know what, I hope to have a really crappy impact today. Everybody goes to work with great intentions, wanting to serve the people that they're there to serve and contribute to their wellness, but sometimes we don't do that. Sometimes we misuse our power accidentally or unintentionally. And feedback is the mechanism that tells us we're doing that so that we can adjust and respond, to be responsive. And so it's pretty fundamental to responsive leadership. And so how do you build feedback pathways in an organization, especially knowing that the people that you serve are more vulnerable than you are? Well, it turns out that there's been lots of research in psychology over the past few decades that point to some common factors that make therapeutic relationships. And I know that you're probably not a therapist, you're a leader of people, but there's actually not that much difference other than the goals. Your goals are to motivate and engage people in performance for the organization. A therapist's goal is to motivate and engage people in their own healing and wellness. And so these common factors are actually applicable across the board, whether you're working with your kids as a parent or your staff. And the ones that really apply to feedback are empathy, curiosity, and non-judgment. And why those things are important is because they build a sense of safety, right? When somebody is not judging me for how I'm doing or what I just did, and they're curious about what might have been motivating that, and they're empathetic, knowing that they too have stress and they too sometimes drop the ball. If you're able to embody those and build skill sets and practice those, then you'll get better as a leader, and you'll get more feedback in your life because people will be more inclined to give feedback to people that they don't feel judgment for, or they feel you actually want to know, you're actually empathetic and curious. F is for feedback. And the thing, if we want to get really deep into neuroscience, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do know about the amygdala, lots about the amygdala, because it registers fear and it registers danger. And in the context of our organizations, feedback, one of the biggest barriers to feedback is actually fear. And not fear in like a terrorized, I fear for my safety, my physical safety, I'm going to get hurt, but emotional fear and anxiety around connection. And so I talked about authenticity versus attachment in the last webinar, and we will sacrifice feedback. We'll sacrifice our authenticity to remain attached to people. And that's because we've got an amygdala that monitors all the stuff that's coming in and registers it as fear, and then sends that information to the pituitary gland, which will release cortisol or adrenaline, and we'll take action based on that. And oftentimes that action will be to keep ourselves safe. And so we'll keep our mouth shut, and we won't give our leader good feedback because we're afraid of the consequences. We're afraid of their reaction and what that might mean for our attachment or our sense of belonging in the organization. And so to think about how can I create conditions of safety so that people aren't afraid to give feedback. And empathy, curiosity, non-judgment, they're a really great start. And so one of the things, I love Simon Sinek's work, and he says, leaders eat last. But I think that leaders actually, they eat last, sure, but they go first, especially around feedback. And so it's your job to be vulnerable. It's your job to put yourself out there and say, hey, my impacts might not be lined up with my intentions. And I'm a human, and I'm probably going to drop the ball, and I'm going to have a negative impact. And so I want to know about it. And so I'm going to be vulnerable, and I'm going to open myself up to feedback, and I'm going to be grateful for it when it comes. And to do that, we really just need to check our ego. And you do that by practicing empathy, right? Stepping out of yourself and into the other person's shoes and wondering what needs, values, strengths, or goals are driving their behavior. Even if we can't see it or they can't articulate it, right? Watching the behavior and saying, I wonder what's going on for that person, right? And being grateful for people, thanking them for their feedback. So as a wrap up, self-awareness around motivation, needs, values, strengths, and goals, power, our personal power, our role power, and our status power, how that shows up in relationship with people, being tuned into that, understanding it, and emotional intelligence, being able to see our impacts and being able to regulate ourselves and being able to notice what we're feeling. Self-care, reconceptualizing self-care, not as optional, not as something that we can rely on people to do on their 2-week vacation or their Friday nights going to yoga, but as something that's deeply part of our practice. How do we embed self-care into our organizations? And finally, feedback. How do we know that our intentions line up with our impacts? How do we create feedback pathways inside of our organization so that people who might be more vulnerable than us, people who we support, are able to give us the feedback we need to continue to grow, and for us to be able to give them feedback? Feedback's probably one of the trickiest things. I work a lot inside of different organizations doing team development and leadership development and organizational development. And pretty universally, feedback is something that we can all improve on and all grow in. So I'd encourage you to self-examine these 3 areas, talk to your colleagues about these 3 areas and see where do we do these things well? Where can we grow? And if you're interested in more about the responsive approach, like I said, we're starting a series. There's going to be a 4-part series. And the first one is on May 30th at 11 a.m. Mountain Standard Time with Stephen DeGroot, who is a colleague of mine out of Winnipeg. And it's really the fundamentals of the responsive approach. How can we create the conditions in which people can really connect and engage with us as leaders and within our organizations? And if you want to check out more, you can check out becomingresponsive.com. We are continually kind of putting up information there. It's a bit of a slow process as we get the wheels started, but there's some videos up there and there's some information about the different programs. And by all means, you can get in contact with us through that if you're interested in learning more about this. And stay tuned for a couple of other webinars. Next week, I think I'm going to talk about meetings, running ridiculously good meetings, because my experience with meetings is they're pretty universally terrible and people don't like going to them. And so it's going to be another short webinar on how to run ridiculously good meetings, different types of meetings, how to facilitate them, how to engage people, and to make them meaningful for you and your organization. So thank you very much for tuning in with me on your lunch hour on this Thursday. I say they're half an hour, but these are only about 20 minutes. And so I appreciate you hanging out with me for the last 20 minutes or so. Hopefully it was useful. If you have any comments or any thoughts, then by all means, send me an email. You can hit reply to any of the emails that come in from me, and we'll start a conversation about these skills and some of the other things that we think are important for you as a leader in your journey and in your growth. So thanks a lot. Have a wonderful rest of your week, and we will hopefully see you next week. Cheers.